You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. It's appropriate that we talk about whom some people believe is the greatest, most legendary American of all time, and we're brought a new take on his life by Mathew Pinsker. It's called Boss Lincoln, the Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln. I'm sure that we're going to get to that ASAP, but I want to mention that you're also one of the foremost historians of the Civil War and Lincoln. And I say that because his book has got endorsements from Michael Burlingame, who's probably the alpha and omega of Lincoln scholars or damn close, and a former podcast guest of ours, James Oakes, another brilliant man and another former podcast guest. He holds the Polkana Chair in American Civil War History and is director of the House Divided Project at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Professor, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a longer introduction than normal because the people who endorse your book, and I should have mentioned Eric Foner, people who endorsed your book are the absolute Valhalla of Lincoln scholars in the world today. Just real quick, you're a scholar yourself. You've done thousands and thousands of hours of research, but how does it feel when people like that, those scholars say, hey, you knocked it out of the park?
Of course, it's a great honor. I've been working on Lincoln for decades, and I know all these guys, and I really appreciate their work. I built from their work, and it's been a lifelong devotion to an important subject.
My favorite biography still of Lincoln is probably, I really like Stephen B. Oates's book, With Malice Towards None. I know it took a little bit of a hit. Is there one that you particularly like the most?
Well, I began my career as a research assistant for David Herbert Donald, and he wrote this great biography of Lincoln called Lincoln in 1995. And, you know, when you talk about the Mount Rushmore of Lincoln scholars, he's number one.
Completely understand. And the listeners of this podcast will recognize him from many, many TV documentaries and C-SPAN. He also had an incredible personal library. I remember seeing pictures of it and just was like in awe.
Yeah, I visited the library. It was amazing. He had one of those, circular studies with ladders. It was a true testament to somebody who devoted his career to reading and writing.
Is it getting more difficult, or was it difficult for you to find a particular niche of Lincoln that hadn't really been studied? Lincoln and Churchill and Napoleon and all these folks, who just get biography after biography. So many of them are so fine, but how do you sort of message the delta to your publisher?
Well, the truth is, this project in some ways started off as a paper in one of Professor Donald's classes. I was writing about Lincoln's first senatorial campaign, 1854-55. And I almost immediately realized that there was an awful lot about that campaign that people didn't appreciate, overlooked. It wasn't well studied. And then it evolved into a dissertation about Lincoln's political life before the Civil War. And in many ways, even back then in the 1980s and early 1990s, I knew that there were elements of his career that were underappreciated because Americans claim they don't like partisanship. and people dismiss it. But Lincoln didn't, and I think it was the core to his success.
We bathe in it. We mean we don't like it. We bathe in it. It's made the
Well,
career of so many incredible people, whether we like it or not, from John F. Kennedy to Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama. The Andrew Jackson. The list goes on. Go ahead,
but
please.
but for us, partisanship is like magic. We don't want to know what happens behind the curtain, and so we pretend like our great heroes were nonpartisan. But of course, they all were partisan. It's just a question of how they managed it and then what they did after they defeated their opponents and how they tried to reunite former rivals and former opponents as common Americans. And that's where Lincoln excels.
Forgive me, and the first biography I ever read of Lincoln is also one of my favorites. Forgive me for forgetting it, and that is the Benjamin Thomas book. I think that is a superb biography, especially written about 100 years ago or close to that, 80 to 100 years ago.
Yeah, it was published in 1952. Of course, it's a classic. I never met Benjamin Thomas. I actually never met Stephen Oates either, but they both have their fans. You're not alone.
Lincoln biography is sometimes mistaken for Lincoln hagiography. How do you avoid that as a scholar, not just an author, but a scholar?
So I believe the most inspiring stories are human stories, and humans are flawed. And Lincoln was flawed just like anybody. Um, and so I find it, rewarding to study someone's mistakes and their moments of indecision. In Lincoln's case, I think he was remarkably determined, authoritative, commanding. That's why I call him Boss Lincoln. But even Boss Lincoln had his moments of doubt and his missteps, and I try to use good detective work and documents to chart them.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Professor Mathew Pinsker. We're discussing his book, Boss Lincoln, The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln has a famous quote, I believe, maybe it's 1860, but as the presidential election of 1860 starts to get closer and closer, his quote is something to the effect of, when it comes to running and the ambition and being president, the taste is in my mouth a little bit.
That's
When
right.
when did that political taste, when did it first become salivating in Lincoln's mouth?
Well, look, he runs for his first political office at the age of 23. It was 1832. He was basically unemployed, living in a new community, New Salem, Illinois, for less than a year. He only had about a year of formal schooling. His family wasn't around him. He was off on his own, and he decides he's qualified for the state legislature of Illinois. That's more than a taste. I mean, that's an awful lot of ambition for a young man, and he lost that election, but he kept at it and won the contest 2 years later and spent the rest of his career in politics and partisanship. He ran for office before he became a lawyer.
Did being a lawyer help his I mean, he lost so many races, we all know, and you detail those in your book, but how did being an attorney and traveling the way they used to back in the mid 19th century, how did that help his political ambition, political network?
Well, two things. So, first of all, of course, being a lawyer helps enormously in politics then and now, especially back then. It's like the intersection of law and politics. We could talk more about that. But second, and kind of important, it's a, it's critical to be precise with Lincoln. He did not think he lost races. You may remember in the book, I talk about how when he wrote an autobiographical sketch on the eve of the presidential campaign, he said he had only been beaten by the people once, and that was that first race in 1832. Now, what he meant by that, and the reason why people get confused, is that back then, voters didn't select U.S. senators. So when Lincoln lost U.S. Senate contests, it was like a legislative election. It's like blaming somebody whose party's in the minority for not winning a speaker's contest. You don't do that. And Lincoln doesn't think of those as defeats. And so we celebrate or remember his Senate losses, especially the one to Douglas in 1858, but he doesn't consider those to be personal setbacks at all. He thinks of himself as a seasoned winner, and that's how I think we should look at him.
Well, as a PR professional by trade, I guess I should say nice spin there, Abe. I get it. Going back to my son, just graduated from law school. He's 10 feet away from me in the basement studying for the bar. Let's go back to the Lincoln and the lawyer aspect because I find it in all the books I've read about him and biographies and so on and so forth, how his legal career put him in a place that, to your point, as a new kid in New Salem, how could he have possibly have thought that he would be as prosperous as he turned out to be? I mean, he was by then standards of the 1840s and 50s, would you say a wealthy man? I mean, not Vanderbilt, but upper middle class?
He was certainly aspiring toward that. He becomes a lawyer in Springfield, and he immediately becomes a popular, influential lawyer. Most people remember his circuit riding stories, and this is kind of like, the intersection of local politics and local law. You're a lawyer who travels from county seat to county seat. You solicit clients, you swap stories, you represent people in court, and then the next day you're out there talking politics at a campaign rally. It all fits, okay? But in my book, what I emphasize is how he was also a lobbyist, and he becomes either wealthy or at least very comfortable
Comfortable, yeah.
lobbying for the Illinois Central Railroad and other railroad companies. He gets the biggest fee paid to a lawyer west of the Mississippi River in the 1850s, representing the Illinois Central. He has to sue to get it all, too. But for me, the point that illustrates how he benefited from politics and how influential he was as a kind of lawyer lobbyist is that the first town ever named after Lincoln was Lincoln, Illinois, named after him in 1853 in deference to his work as a railroad lobbyist to get the plot chartered. And, that's 5 years before the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's 7 years before the presidential election, and it's a full decade before the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's the first town ever named after him in deference to his work as a lobbyist.
A lot of people are aspiring politicians and they run for, of course, here in Indiana, where I live, there are 7,000 layers of government, right? Townships, counties, state, cities, goes on and on. But not everyone sets their sights on quote unquote the big time. What made, in your view, what made Abraham Lincoln think I can be a state rep in Springfield, but I can also move up and do these other things on a national and international scale?
All right, well, some of this is projection because we only have scattered documents and evidence. But you remember the Lincoln family starts off in Kentucky. Then they cross the river and they come up to Indiana. Lincoln grows up as a boy in southern Indiana. But you've got to realize something. What he experienced was a lot of frustration. Now, his father, we often describe Thomas Lincoln as a farmer, but he was really a carpenter. He was a fine carpenter, and there's still Thomas Lincoln pieces scattered around museums in the Ohio Valley. But he couldn't raise a family. He couldn't produce enough income as a carpenter out in the wild region, as Lincoln called it, of southern Indiana. And so, he was a scratch farmer. They struggled to survive. And then eventually they moved to central Illinois in hopes of a better life. And it was there that Lincoln set out on his own to New Salem, which was like a small river town. And when he ran for office, his first campaign in 1832, he presents himself as an experienced waterways guy, a flatboatman who was pushing for waterways improvements. And in my book, what I argue is that from the beginning, he had this national vision of trying to create what we would call a highway, but like the connected waterways of the Mississippi and Ohio valleys to create a national trade route that would make farmer families, carpenter families, small business families like his more successful by giving them easier access to markets. And so it's that national vision that makes him a Whig. They believe in infrastructure and they believe in the government's role in helping people make themselves prosperous. And ultimately, it was that interest in what they called back then river and harbor improvements that got him to Chicago in 1847. That was his first national exposure. He's covered by all the major newspapers. And it's a launch pad into his career in Congress and beyond. and I use it to open up the book.
You mentioned the Whigs, a short-lived but relatively successful political party in the early to mid 19th century, post Andrew Jackson. Lincoln is often he's often paired with Henry Clay in terms of his political idol, the person after whom he mentored himself.
Your day moves fast. Your news should too. That's why there's a new and improved Wish TV app bringing you more local news, breaking alerts, live streaming, weather forecast, radar, and Indiana sports all in one place. Customize your news feed to see the stories that matter most to you and get the information you need when you need it. Download the new and improved Wish TV app today on iOS or Android and take News 8 with you everywhere.
Or modeled himself, excuse me. Is that a fair comparison? Because it came up in your book, comes up in all those biographies for that time period where Lincoln sees Clay as his, beau ideal.
If you go back to your Benjamin Thomas biography or your Stephen Oates biography, they're going to call Lincoln a Henry Clay Whig. And in my book, I argue that's kind of a mistake. He did admire Clay, and he called himself a Henry Clay Whig. But like you said, it was partly marketing, because what Lincoln realized from the beginning was, even though the Whig Party had some success, it was fighting uphill, especially in Illinois. And he was what they called a Whig fusionist. He didn't believe the party should be a cult of personality. And in my book, I argue that what defined him as a Whig was his willingness to break with Clay at critical moments. Lincoln goes to that River and Harbor Convention in 1847. He's pushing river and harbor improvements as a way to expand the Whig Party by bringing in Democrats on this popular issue. Democrats from the West believed in river and harbor improvements. Jacksonian Democrats were skeptical of it because they thought it was too much federal government intervention, and they believed in limited government. So Lincoln goes to Congress, and he's the only Whig from Illinois. He's kind of an important Whig leader. He's already like the state party boss in 1848, and Henry Clay wants another shot at running for president. He's already run for president twice before, and he's old, but he wants a final chance, and the Whigs seem to have a real shot at it, and Lincoln doesn't support him. He supports General Zachary Taylor, who's a kind of blank slate as a politician, but a popular, military hero. And Lincoln is about winning. He's a pragmatist. He downplays the issues. He emphasizes popularity. And that's what makes him a Whig fusionist. And then in the book, I have one really powerful scene that I don't think was in the Thomas biography or the Oates biography. You could check me on this if you want. Go back to your library after the podcast. But Lincoln delivered a eulogy when Henry Clay died in 1852. And by the way, in that eulogy, he doesn't use the word Whig once, okay? He talks about Clay in terms of other qualities. But during the Civil War, when he was sitting around the White House chopping it up one afternoon with William Seward, who was also a former Whig, they talked about Lincoln's eulogy to Clay, and none of these other biographers have mentioned this, but there was somebody in the room with them who wrote it down in his diary, and he says, Lincoln tells Seward, when I was preparing that eulogy for Clay, I looked up other eulogies that he might have given to see how he did it, and I couldn't find one. And Seward said to Lincoln, that's because he was too selfish. And then they both started gossiping about how selfish Clay was as a party leader. And you can see there the kind of private side where Lincoln was critical of Clay. He never admitted it in public, but behind the scenes, he had questions about Clay's leadership, and he saw himself as a different kind of party leader.
Clay lost in 48, and is that right? He lost in 40.
Lincoln never lost a congressional race.
No. I meant Clay. Clay lost to
Clay lost
24.
the nomination battle to Zachary Taylor. The Whigs nominated Taylor, and Taylor won.
Mm-hmm.
And then Lincoln was aspiring to get a job in the administration. Some people call this a political defeat. He was kind of vying for a sub-cabinet position that he didn't get. Now, it's a minor thing, but there's a lot of documents. And in my book, I spend some time going through those private notes that Lincoln wrote because they're so revealing. I mean, he's a 40-year-old man, but he's full of, tough, commanding, party leader like insights. He's critical of Clay, and he just emerges in the notes as a different kind of figure. He just sounds different than the way we remember him.
Which post did he want, and why didn't he get it? I love this part of your book, as I've worked for mayors and governors and other elected officials, and they all want to surround themselves with people they trust, who they feel have earned a spot, who will do good work for their constituents. Why wasn't Lincoln held in this esteem?
So he's trying to control the commissionership of what they called the General Land Office. It was a lucrative job where you got a percentage of the federal lands that you sold. And so it was a way to make money, but it was also an important job. It controlled a lot of patronage. And the Taylor administration gave it to somebody who had been a Clay supporter, a lawyer from Chicago. It was kind of their way of bridging the factions. But Lincoln thought that was a mistake. He argued to them they need to reward their loyalists like him. Now, he didn't really want the job at first, but he became convinced that if it wasn't him, it was going to go to one of these Clay supporters like this guy, Justin Butterfield, the attorney from Chicago. And so he was determined to prevent that, and he fought hard. And the documents exist, and some of them are brand new. They've only been discovered in the last decade or so. And it just reveals how tough he was behind the scenes. He was tough, but he still suffered a setback here. I mean, he didn't get the job. Butterfield got the job. But in my book, what I argue is some people, again, you go back to like the standard biographies, they talk about how then Lincoln enters into a period of like political retirement, where he gets disappointed over his setback and thinks about giving up politics. That's how Lincoln himself described it in public a few years later. But he wasn't retired at all. He wasn't tired of politics. He was tired of Whig politics. And what happens over the next 5 years is he works to build what they call at first an anti-slavery fusion, and then what ultimately becomes the Republican Party.
So Taylor wanting to unite the party in some sort of like fusion-esque act is not okay to Lincoln, because he wants him to be more partisan and reward his friends. And that was my favorite. I have to say, this my favorite part of the book. Your book is terrific. Is Lincoln just basically wanting to, hey, let me have some candy, or at least let me pass out the candy, one of the two that'll raise my esteem here in my home state. And that's not the only time, was it, that he was kind of ignored or looked over for, possible sort of honors, for lack of a better term?
Look, it was a difficult time to be a Whig in Illinois. It was a Democratic majority state. It was easy to overlook Whigs like Lincoln. They didn't control much. He had to fight and scrap for everything. And in that little land office episode that you enjoyed so much, I mean, you even see Lincoln telling some small lies in his correspondence. Now, the good news here is I don't call him Boss Lincoln because he was Boss Tweed. He's not some corrupt party boss. He's not some hack. But Honest Abe was not always Candid Abe, and sometimes he could be a little misleading. I mean, you have to be in politics. But when you catch Lincoln doing it in black and white, it's still startling.
When did he win his first federal office? How did that win come about? And how was his time in DC?
Well, he won an election to Congress in 1846, right at the outset of the Mexican War. He doesn't start serving though until 1848 or late 1847. Back then, Congress it wasn't as studious and diligent as they are now. They only met a few months a year. And so he got elected in 46. He started serving in December 47. He served one term. This all happens during that election contest that ultimately saw Taylor win. And then he leaves in 1849. And then he doesn't have another federal office again until he becomes president in 1861.
Is it fair to say that let me ask a different way. That way you can correct me. Would it be an overstatement to assert the 1850s were the formative decade for Abraham Lincoln politically, more than any other decade.
Well, there's no doubt that the 1850s was a period of crisis. He learned an awful lot during this period, and he began to focus on the meaning of the Declaration and the fight over slavery. It transforms him. In my book, I argue it's what made him a great wartime leader. I don't think he ends up in Washington in 1861 as some inexperienced, overwhelmed prairie attorney who's thrust into this position as commander in chief. I think he came into that job better prepared than you could have ever expected because he understood the one thing that any president during a civil war needs to understand, which is you have to build and sustain coalitions. And that's why during the Civil War is probably his, defining period, the 1860s, but the the genius he showed as a coalition builder, as a union leader during the Civil War, that was born out of the crisis of the 1850s, like you said.
To me, the best example of that is his treatment of, and I'm going to try not to get ahead of myself or ourselves, but to your point, the illustration that comes up to me, the evidence to back up what you just said, which is obviously 100% correct, is Lincoln's attitude towards Kentucky during the war.
No doubt. Look, Kentucky is one of those so-called border states. There are 4 slave states that remain in the Union. There were 15 slave states total. When Lincoln takes office in March of 1861, 7 of the 15 had seceded, which meant that a majority of slave states were still in the Union. If Lincoln could convince those 8 to stay, then the Civil War is over in a year and the Union prevails. Now, he makes his pitch, as we all know, appeals to the better angels of our nature, as we all remember, and he splits them. 4 go with the Confederacy and 4 go with the Union, like Kentucky, although it was a close-run affair there, just like it was in Maryland and some other places. But nonetheless, because he split them, the Union could still prevail. If he had lost all 8, the Confederates would have won. I have no doubt. Washington would have fallen because it was sandwiched between Maryland and Virginia. And so, it's to Lincoln's genius that he was able to figure out a way to at least win over 4 of those border states. And he did it with a variety of tools. Some of them were rhetorical, and some of them were much more tough-minded than that, like suspending habeas corpus or mobilizing troops. It was a close-run affair, and it wasn't easy, and he had to make very tough decisions.
Do you want to recite the famous Lincoln quote about Kentucky, or do you want me to do it?
Well, there are different versions of it. In one of his letters to Orville Browning, he says, he believes it's the whole game. The whole game is to get Kentucky into the Union. There's one attributed to him where he says, I'd like to have God on my side, but I need Kentucky. He didn't write that down, so I don't have it in the book. But the only quotes I use in the book were quotes that were written down at the time. And I think it gives it a sense of credibility, but also you can hear the urgency in the written documents too.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. We are also a federally certified, veteran-owned small business, registered with the state of Indiana and the city of Indianapolis. Our guest, Professor Mathew Pinsker. We're discussing his truly seminal book. I don't know how many biographies I've read of Lincoln, 20, 25. There were a lot of things in this book that I had never read before, and that's just such kudos to you and why you received such fabulous reviews. Professor Pinsker's book is called Boss Lincoln, The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln. Going back to the 1850s, it's such a fun, as a history lover, it's such a wonderful decade to read about. So much of what we tried to do, what we failed to do to avoid the Civil War is caught up in that decade. Are there 1 or 2 sort of specific events in the 1850s that you'd like to mention? Like this could have gone if this had gone the other way, then maybe the Civil War wouldn't happen when it did.
I'm trained not to answer that question. These hypotheticals and
We like
alternative history.
counterfactuals. As
Yeah,
amateur historians, we like counterfactuals.
no doubt.
But if the Dred Scott decision had gone the other way, if the Kansas Nebraska Act hadn't passed, if John Brown, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, there are all these turning points. It starts with the Compromise of 1850. In my book, I try to show how much impact that fugitive slave law had behind the scenes on pragmatic politicians like Abraham Lincoln, and how it forced them into all kinds of contortions to try to explain away the violence that was happening. It's revealing, but it's also kind of a grim reminder that in American politics, there's an awful lot of violence and has been in many different ways over the years. There was sporadic violence throughout the 1850s. It was topsy-turvy from what we remember. Everybody thinks the war was about states' rights, and they think about states' rights as a Southern issue. But in the 1850s, states' rights was a Northern issue. They passed personal liberty laws in states like Pennsylvania that were designed to prevent the enforcement of the federal fugitive slave law. For most of the decades, slaveholders were appealing to the federal government to protect them, whether it was the Democratic administrations in power, like Pierce or Buchanan, or whether it was like the Supreme Court led by Roger Taney, who's a graduate of Dickinson College, where I teach, in that Dred Scott decision that you were talking about. And yes, at any point, if any of those different events had gone another way, it would have changed the dynamic. I don't think the war was inevitable at all. I mean, if you put it to me that way, the way you did, I would say any other president but Lincoln in the secession crisis of 1860-61 probably would have found a way to delay the conflict. And Lincoln was the one who said the tug has to
To
come,
come.
and better now than any time hereafter. His toughness is, I think, the turning point, the final one.
Sorry, but that quote was in my brain, in my cleft palate as I was getting ready to say, because I think it's such a great quote from Lincoln that's like, we've put this off, we've tried to compromise, the South is determined. So we're going to give them what they want. Almost Sherman-esque in a lot of ways, where Sherman's, we'll burn everything, but once the war's over, I'll give you my cracker, my last cracker.
Lincoln was capable of fluidity. He could be a fusionist, and then he could be what they called back then an ultraist. He was somebody who could talk, compromise, appeal to better angels of our nature, but he could also be firm and not budge on matters of policy. And he alternated. I tell my students, I'm like, which way is the right way? It's like asking whether it's better to breathe in or breathe out. Lincoln learned that you got to do both to live,
Mm.
and he alternated between them depending on the circumstances.
You mentioned states' rights, and I'm going to get to one more question about that kind of before we move on to Lincoln as president. Two things. If I were to write a paper in your class that argued as intelligently as I could, that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War, how would you receive that paper?
I give my students a lot of latitude to make arguments, even if I don't agree with them. In a class, it's more about the process than about the bottom line. And so it's hard to make the argument that it's about states' rights because it's the state right to protect slavery that's driving these Southerners. And I would challenge you if you wrote that paper and showed me a draft, which I usually require. And I'd like to see how you responded to that, because I don't think there is much response to it. It's not just, states' rights in theory, it's states' rights in practice that's driving this conflict. And that practice is the practice of slavery. So I'd be open-minded, but on the other hand, I would also be firm in insisting that you respond to skeptical voices and challenges and that you deal with evidence.
One of the podcasts I've done on the Civil War, and I'm lucky enough to have talked to so many incredible historians. I forget which one, but made the comment is like, slavery defined us geographically. And I said, well, what do you mean, like north, south? And he said, no, west. He goes, Indiana, Illinois, and all, that was the west until slavery became the central issue of our country and our politics. Then it was north, south. Because that's how slavery defined us. Is that a fair statement?
Of course. And look, Stephen Douglas in 1854, he is explicitly trying to organize an East-West dynamic because he thinks it'll benefit the Democratic Party, and he's hopeful that his Kansas-Nebraska Act will somehow paper over the North-South tension about slavery. Of course, it makes it worse, not better. But he tells his lieutenants, his political subordinates, we're going east-west. This is how we're going to do it. And he supports not only, expansion westward and opening up the territories, but he also starts talking about river and harbor improvements, which is why that term, these waterways improvements, were so important, but they've been kind of forgotten. It's about the old east-west axis of American politics that got overwhelmed by the north-south axis about slavery. And yet we shouldn't forget it because, when you lived through it, you couldn't predict what would happen. Nobody knew for sure that the country was hurtling towards civil war. And, we had lots of conflicts in American history that didn't dissolve into civil war and might have.
The tariff of abomination. It's interesting that Lincoln loved what, correct me if I'm wrong, but Lincoln was such a fan of how Jackson reacted to John C. Calhoun and the tariff crisis in 1830-ish. But yet Jackson is not exactly a Henry Clay fan. Let's just put it that way.
I mean, Lincoln detested Jackson's views, but he respected his toughness. When he got really mad at Zachary Taylor during that land office episode we were talking about a few minutes ago, he wrote a letter to Taylor's Secretary of State where he said toughness was Jackson Sampson's locks. And you don't want to look like a man of straw, a mere man of straw. Lincoln understood you had to be decisive as a leader, and you had to exude a kind of authority. And he thought Jackson was a model for that, even as he disagreed with Jackson's policies.
Another takeaway from your book, which, obviously anyone who has read any about this time period certainly has certainly a frame of reference, but the way you talked about it really has put it forefront in my mind, especially as I will hopefully interview other Civil War historians and American historians. The effect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, on American political discourse and Abraham Lincoln's mindset. Is it impossible to overstate it?
No, it's one of the great turning points of the coming of the war. It creates the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is the first sectional party in American history that can take national power, meaning it's the first party that doesn't really have any support in the slave states, nothing significant. And yet it's going to, be able to capitalize on the population advantage in the free states in the North and the West and the electoral college advantage it has once Lincoln can figure out a way to lead the party in 1860 to win states like Illinois and Indiana, swing states. It makes it possible for a political party to appear like a mortal threat to one section of the country. That's the difference mainly between the kind of sectional polarization they experienced, which led to civil war, and the kind of polarization we're experiencing right now. It's not divided into national sections the way it was. I mean, I know we have blue states and red states,
Right.
but it's kind of scattered, and it doesn't lend itself to the kind of civil war they experience. Although Lord knows there are all kinds of civil wars, and we don't want to take anything for granted.
Is there a particular Hoosier leader or legend you admire most?
That's a good question. I'm an old Birch Bayh kind of guy, if you know what I'm saying. If you want to leap into another era, but there's plenty of them. I used to like Lee Hamilton. You remember him? Good guy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I did a podcast with 3 of Birch Bayh's staffers, and also did a podcast with Evan Bayh, his son, and we talk a lot about his dad and stuff. If you like, I'll send them to you. But
Yeah.
when the first time I met Evan Bayh, he was a senator, and I was working for the Indianapolis mayor, and I'd shaken his hand 100 times, but I had said, I'm Robert Vane. Nice to meet you again. And Evan Bayh goes, nice to meet you. He was very kind. And I said, may I tell you something? And he said, sure. And I said, I remember my mother crying when your mother died. And he was very genuine about it, very cordial. Let's get Lincoln into the White House. March 4th, 1861, he's inaugurated. He's elected in early November of 18. The first state, South Carolina, I believe it secedes on December 20th, 1860, starts the march. So South Carolina, of course, they got what was coming to it later on in the war. But all these states are starting to go. Lincoln, you have the what is it, 5 months between election and the lame duck. Is that what's called, the lame duck law, or what was it, the lame
Well,
duck
that's the
amendment?
lame duck session of Congress
Yeah.
and the outgoing president, but
Yeah.
it's the inaugural period was much different then. They inaugurated presidents in March. The election was still in November. They did the electoral count, the certification in February, but it was a long, tense period.
Certified by John C. Breckinridge, who was vice president at the time, and then left D.C. and became a Confederate general eventually. I had the pleasure of telling that story to my former boss, Mike Pence, when we were discussing some January 20th stuff. But even John C. Breckinridge, who was leaving the country as a quote unquote traitor, knew that he had a constitutional job to do and did it.
Right.
What happens?
Just like Pence did.
Just like Pence did. Politically, the first year or so of Lincoln's time as president, does he have the energy? Does he have the time to be involved politically in some of the things that, he used to think were so important when he wasn't in the White House?
Well, that's what's remarkable. He never stops. So he's always Boss Lincoln. Even the day after Sumter, he has a meeting about patronage in the New York Customs House. And we have notes that he took at the meeting. He's sitting there for hours trying to negotiate between the Republican Party factions to make sure everybody gets a piece. It's not the way you imagine the Civil War playing out, but it's the reality of it. And some of his advisors were telling him, you're wasting too much time on this. But remember, we talked about his experience with Taylor and how he criticized Taylor for making bad decisions over patronage. Lincoln called this the lessons of experience. He was determined not to make the same mistakes. And so he spent an awful lot of time handling basic matters of party management, even though it was the middle of a civil war.
Was Boss Lincoln a committed fusionist by this point?
So he starts off the war thinking he's going to run a Republican administration with you could call it a nonpartisan military, but in my book, I argue it's smarter to think about it as a multi-partisan military. Like he's taking into account people's partisanship. He's just trying to stitch together all the different parties that were represented at the time: Democrats, constitutional unionists, other types of conservatives, Republicans, even abolitionists. He's finding a place for all of them. But that process doesn't work so well. And by the summer of 62, heading into the second year of the war, heading into the midterm elections, they begin to realize that they have to do something else. So they try to create a fusion movement that they call the Union Party that will unite everybody who supports the war. And eventually, over the next 2 years, that becomes the third party that Lincoln helps lead and build, the Union Party. And it's the key to his success. He didn't think you could save the Union until you built a Union Party. And yet most people don't remember it. And again, not to pick on poor Benjamin Thomas or Stephen Oates, but you go back to their books, and they don't talk about this. They just use the word Republican as a placeholder throughout the war. But Lincoln stopped calling himself a Republican during the war. And he doesn't use the term in public after 1862. And most of the Republican committees in Indiana and elsewhere rename themselves as the Union Committee. And the newspapers, adopt Union banners. And they argue over what type of unionism. Lincoln's a national unionist. Some of the radicals, like Salmon Chase, his Secretary of Treasury from Ohio, called themselves unconditional unionists. And this is the battle of politics over emancipation. But it's a party battle, and it's a battle over the creation of this Union Party.
You mentioned the fusionist nature of his appointments in the military sphere. Nathaniel Banks was Speaker of the House, Democrat; Benjamin Butler, George McClellan, the list goes on and on. Of course, my favorite quote is from Grant, who, when asked about, what is it, Buchanan, the 56 race, Grant says, I voted I vote Grant says I voted for Buchanan because I didn't know him and against Freeman because I did.
Yeah,
So,
Grant had been a Democrat before the
yeah,
war.
Sherman.
Right, Sherman as well, but they you know, at least in Grant's case, I think he comes around to the, emancipation issue. Sherman was always a little more ambivalent about it,
Exactly.
but nonetheless, they were warriors, and Lincoln, elevated them and appreciated their fighting spirit, and, when he found a Democrat who didn't have that fighting spirit, like McClellan, he eventually demoted them.
Is it fair to say that the fusionist approach that he took towards military commanders, he also took towards his own cabinet, which is kind of the main thesis of the Team of Rivals book by Doris Kearns Goodwin?
Yeah, this gets complicated. So you have to be clear about something. When Lincoln forms this team of rivals, all those men were Republicans. Lincoln refuses to let in any non Republican into the cabinet because he says they have to get right with us on the slavery question. Now, there's talk that he's going to bring in somebody from the Upper South, but they never do it because they can't get somebody who's willing to say that slavery is wrong. And then during the war, he's a fusionist, like you said, but he's also an ultraist because he says that emancipation is a military necessity. And so, he requires his military officers and his cabinet members to support his emancipation policies. And eventually, they become his abolition policies. Now, there's a lot of different forces at work here. Lincoln's not the only one. But as the country moves toward that 13th Amendment, and they're attacking slavery on multiple different fronts, from congressional confiscation to military emancipation to the Abolition Amendment, as they're doing all of that, Lincoln is figuring out a way to have a fusion of men around a set of ultra measures. And that's genius. And that's what I try to describe in the book.
You think he succeeded?
Huh. That's the one thing I think we could all agree on, right? He freed the slaves and saved the Union. Now, it was at a high cost, and freeing the slaves doesn't solve every problem. I mean, if you want to go to counterfactuals, we can ask whether Lincoln, if he had lived, would have been able to lead the country toward a multiracial democracy. At the end of the book, I start to sketch out how he was dealing with that. But that might have been even too great a problem for him to overcome.
May I ask you to tell the Leaders and Legends podcast audience your thoughts on the movie Lincoln?
Well, I love the movie. Steven Spielberg could do things with Hollywood magic that I can't do in a book, but it's not a textbook. It's fiction. It's pure Hollywood. And, the dialogue's invented, the scenes are rearranged. You can't get your history from the movie, but you could certainly enjoy it. Daniel Day-Lewis's performance alone, is mesmerizing.
The Emancipation Proclamation was issued in the fall of 1862 after the Battle of Antietam, which was September 17th, 1862. In what ways, you mentioned military necessity a few minutes ago, in what ways is that a political document?
So consider this. Lincoln drafts the proclamation in July of 62 after Congress has battled with him over something they call confiscation legislation, which also includes provisions to free slaves as captives of war. That's language from the legislation. And yet, in July of 62, Lincoln sets January 1st, 1863 as the date for when this will take effect. But he's convinced by his cabinet advisors, led by William Seward, to delay announcing all of this until there's a victory on the battlefield. Now, with military necessity, the worse things get, the more necessary the response is. So clearly, if they're waiting for a victory, it's not really military necessity that's at least driving the timing of the announcement. That's pure political necessity. And why January 1st, 1863? Because that would be after Congress had come back into session. He drafted this measure after they had finished and were leaving, and now he's going to give them a chance to weigh in December of 62 before he makes it take effect in January. And so the battlefield victory at Antietam is when he announces that they're going to implement this policy on January 1st, but it was already pre-cooked. None of this was developing in response to events. It was all political strategy. And, I think was brilliant political strategy. It was partly aimed at the courts, a hostile Supreme Court. It was partly aimed at the politics of the North, the division between Democrats and Republicans. And it's the effort to provide a framework that can unite Democrats who support the war with Republicans who are anti-slavery into this unionist coalition. And that's what emancipation is all about. It's like it's a framework for sustaining a winning coalition.
Do you agree with my favorite history, no matter what the time period, is diplomatic history? Do you agree with Secretary of State Seward that just issuing it, maybe without taking a battlefield victory or at least a campaign strategic victory into mind, would have been seen as a last quote unquote last shriek by countries like Britain and France? Was that good advice, or do you think it would not have mattered eventually?
No, I think it was good advice. Lincoln begins that meeting by saying, "I don't need your advice. I've made my mind up." And then, yeah, these guys give him advice anyway. It's classic. He takes Seward's advice. Seward's a shrewd guy, but Seward's also a strange guy. He's older than Lincoln by about a decade, and he's been through the wars. He almost gets dumped from the cabinet. He's under a lot of pressure. By 1863, he's actually telling Lincoln's top aides in private, "We never should have even issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't necessary." And so, he's anti-slavery, but he's convinced that you don't need to make proclamations about it. You just do it. And Lincoln, I think, is more convinced that you need to have a documented framework that conservatives, Democrats, and Republicans can all support for their own reasons. And that's why military necessity is such an important framework for that, because it gives opponents of the policy a chance to explain why they're supporting it. Not because they believe in the liberation of enslaved blacks, but because they believe in winning the war. And that's Lincoln's genius.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Professor Mathew Pinsker. We're discussing his phenomenal book, Boss Lincoln, The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln. In 1862, the administration takes a political beating in the elections in 1862, which the midterms, which isn't exactly uncommon for a president. What happens between 62 and 64 when he's reelected in a race? And I forget whose book I read about the 1864 election that talks about how much more close that election was than it just seems by the pure numbers. I think Lincoln got 212 electoral votes and maybe McClellan got 21 or something like that. But several states were very close. But in that time period, how does Lincoln mature as a political leader?
Well, first of all, back then, the midterms extend over a couple of years. So they start in 62, but they go through to 63. And so after they take some beating in the fall of 62, they are determined to try to explain, defend, and expand on their emancipation policy and also the recruitment of black soldiers as a policy in a way that would help them win states. And they begin to start winning more elections in the spring of 63. State elections, other midterm elections, they continue through the summer. And then there's important statewide elections in the fall of 63, like in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Of course, during that period of time, in my book, I talk about an orator for the Unionist Party who's now become a celebrity. She's like an influencer. It's a woman named Anna Dickinson. She gets left out of most Lincoln biographies. But she's very popular. She helps the party win in New England. And then she becomes the first woman really to speak to what's essentially a joint session of Congress in January 64. She's a radical who supports Lincoln and the Unionists. And so she addresses Congress with Lincoln sitting there in the audience and endorses him for re-election. It's part of the effort to try to unify the coalition where he's vying against this radical Salmon Chase, his own Treasury Secretary for the nomination, and he outlasts him. Dickinson's endorsement, a few other factors like the president's appearance at Gettysburg in November, that all creates the momentum that he needs to drive Chase out of the contest in February, and then by June he's renominated by the National Union Party, and he's kind of presiding over a relatively unified coalition. Although in the summer, they experienced setbacks because of defeats and frustration on the battlefield, and then there's a new wave of anxiety over his reelection effort.
If the election had been held I'm sorry for the counterfactual. If the election had been held a few months earlier, your guess, based on decades of scholarship, would the
Yeah, look,
result have been different?
we don't have polls, so, you never know. But the people around Lincoln thought he was gonna lose in the summer, and he held firm. He didn't flip-flop on emancipation, he didn't cancel the elections. I think he always thought he could ride it out and that they would win. But no doubt other external factors like Sherman taking Atlanta and other progress on the battlefields in Virginia and the divisions within the Democratic Party themselves, which Lincoln behind the scenes helped to stoke. They all create what turns into a landslide impression. Admittedly, there were a few states that could have turned it if they had been flipped, but the ultimate result of the 64 elections were not just Lincoln's 55% of the popular vote, but also supermajority control in both the House and the Senate. So the Unionists were in a pretty strong position.
Did Lincoln still enjoy, he's dealing with Gettysburg, he's got the Trent Affair, he's all the things, emancipation, paying for the war, keeping the Europeans out of it. But did Lincoln still enjoy that or get involved with small town, small p politics and party matters? Did he still enjoy it? Because he seemed like even though he didn't have much luck in a lot of ways, he seemed like that he was kind of fascinated by it.
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing I can tell you for sure is he never lost his energy. Some people think of him as suffering from depression or melancholy. I don't. He was a workaholic. He clocked in, he clocked out. He was very regular. He never seemed to flag in his attention, his energy. He attended meetings. He followed the news. He engaged both in the White House and outside of the White House in acts of persuasion. He did everything he could with public letters and innovative ways to try to communicate with the general public. I can't tell you for sure if he enjoyed it all, but he seemed to have no lack of energy and attention for it, and that's what you need.
Is it surprising to you as a Lincoln scholar and the author of Boss Lincoln that Boss Lincoln didn't leave Washington, D.C. to go campaign for someone running for a particular office that he never, Jefferson Davis famously ventured out of Richmond several times for conferences with generals and such, and Lincoln did the same. Did he feel that his task at hand was just too important?
Well, you got to remember the norms were different then. So, they talked about presidents standing for office, not running for office. Lincoln didn't campaign for president in 1860. He stayed in Springfield. He never left Springfield. Douglas broke that norm because, the Democratic Party had split apart. He had no choice. But, the theory was if you ran for office, you didn't deserve the office. And so it was rare, almost unprecedented, for a president to try to influence elections in the midterms or other contests by traveling to those places. Now, Lincoln did intervene in those contests with public letters, like his famous letter to Greeley in the summer of 1862, which in my book I describe as like a platform for the Union Party in the midterm elections. And trust me, those local politicians were grateful for it. And he did the same thing in 1863 when they asked him to come to Springfield, Illinois at a Union rally. And he wrote a letter to the organizer, James Conkling, the mayor, and they read it at the rally. Now, that was unprecedented intervention by a president at that time. It seems kind of small potatoes to us, but just because we're used to different norms. But he was as aggressive as anybody else was in that era, and arguably much more so.
We have just a few minutes before we get to the 5 questions. What would be your epitaph, epilogue for Lincoln as a political leader, as a political participant? Just win, baby, like Al Davis, or something a little more ethical or moralistic?
Lincoln was a believer in the creed of a government of the people, by the people, for the people. What makes him great is that he made democracy work. And I think he's our greatest president. And it's Probably because he's our deepest thinker about American democracy and the machinery of popular government. Yeah, democracy is not the Greek word for perfect, but it might as well be the Greek word for disagreement, and he understood how to manage disagreements.
Is it a mistake to put him on such high a pedestal that we don't recognize that aspect of his personality and ambition?
For sure. I think if we had a greater respect for the machinery of politics and, for the ground game and for the blocking and tackling of politics, then we would be better at it. I think part of the reason why politics seems broken right now is because we romanticize the past and we hold the present to these ridiculous standards that are disconnected from like reality on planet Earth. And we need to be more practical. Lincoln was very practical, and I think principled, but also practical. And I think right now we need more practical wisdom in order to get along better, even when we disagree.
We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Professor Pinsker, are you ready?
Shoot.
What was your first job?
I worked on the beach as a chairboy for the lifeguards, bringing out chairs for the summer customers down in Ventnor, New Jersey.
I love Wildwood. Love it.
Mhm.
It's one of my favorite beaches anywhere. I don't know if there's anything hotter than New Jersey in August.
I
Hotter and
love the
more
Jersey
humid.
Shore. Love the Jersey
Absolutely.
Shore.
What was your first concert?
I'll tell you the truth, I'm a little tone deaf. I'm not very good at music, and I don't go to too many concerts. But it wasn't my first, but my most memorable was my wife and I once went to see Aretha Franklin, and I'll never forget that.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
It's a great question. I'm going to do fiction, nonfiction. For fiction, I love Robert Penn Warren, All the King's Men. And for nonfiction, I'd say get a book of Lincoln's collected speeches and writings and just read that. I think nobody does it better than him.
If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh man, I would love to be in the Lincoln White House in 1864 when he's making his decisions about how to win that contest and save the war effort. I have all these theories about what was going on in his head, but I'd like to know for sure that I'm right.
Very quickly, it's in your book, and it's also a famous part of Lincoln lore where he makes the note, it looks likely the administration will not be reelected, so on and so forth, and he has all his cabinet members sign it. And they
They call
sign it
that the
without
blind
reading it.
memorandum
Yeah. Where
because
is
they
that?
signed it without reading it.
Yeah, they signed it without reading it. Where is that? Does that still exist?
Yeah, I've held it in my hands. It's in the Library of Congress. It's an amazing document. In my book, I argue people just completely misunderstand it. They weren't signing their loyalty to that document. They were date stamping it so that Lincoln could use it in case he lost. I don't think he thought he was going to lose, but I think he was such a practical politician. He was preparing this in case of emergency break glass moment. And that would be the ultimate fusion in between November and March of 1865 to try to work with the next president-elect, who, by the way, would have been George McClellan.
Could any ordinary schmo like me get a hold of that document?
You can certainly see it online. It's digitized, and you can see it from the Library of Congress. I don't think they would let you hold it. But,
I know I should have went to Harvard.
the Library of Congress is open, and people could go to the manuscript room. You have to register, but some of the priceless documents are kept away from the public. But generally, it's open to anybody to research.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a Steelers fan, and I'm going to tell you something. I would like to get Mike McCarthy in a room and give him some ideas and suggestions about how to turn this thing around, because even more important than politics, it's football. And he needs advice, in my opinion.
So not Barack Obama, not Terry Bradshaw. You want to say, hey, help me with my fantasy football team. What are you doing?
I'll tell you something. I want to see a Super Bowl win for Steeler Nation before I die.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. We are a federally certified, veteran-owned small business registered with the state of Indiana and the city of Indianapolis. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, author, Professor Mathew Pinsker. He wrote a book where I have to say I learned things about Lincoln that I had never known before. That, of course, gets increasingly more difficult the more you read, right? But your treatment of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, has really made that something that I'll never forget. His book is titled Boss Lincoln, The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln. Professor, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. I emailed you completely out of the blue, and you responded, and thanks to my friendship with Miss Ruth Squillaci, you're on the podcast. You did a fabulous job, and I couldn't be more grateful.
Well, thank you. I got to tell you, you know your stuff. You put me through the ringer here, but I appreciated it. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. That's very, very kind. Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.